She stood alone on the train platform, while the whole town watched a man walk away from her. Not a stranger. The man she had traveled hundreds of miles to marry. He said the words loud. Loud enough that the people near the ticket window heard every one of them. Loud enough that the two men outside the feed store turned to look. He said he couldn't go through with it, and he said it in front of all of them, because a coward who is about to do a cruel thing would rather do it with a crowd than face one woman alone in a quiet room. Maren Ashby did not cry. She did not shout. She stood with her single bag at her feet and her chin level, and she let him finish, because she had decided somewhere between the last station and this one that whatever happened, she was not going to fall apart where people could see. He held up a folded stack of papers as if they proved something, as if they gave him a right. Then he thought better of it, put them back in his coat, and walked off the platform without once looking back. The people watching drifted away. By supper, half the town of Coldwater Bend would know. By morning, the rest of them would. And Maren stood there, with her whole life in one bag, and no idea what came next. So how does a woman who was thrown away on a train platform end up, one winter later, standing in a warm kitchen while a little girl calls her mama, and a man empties 2 years of savings just to keep her? Let me take you back, because the answer starts with a question, a simple one. 3 words a stranger asked her that afternoon that changed everything. Stay with me. The coach from the Saddle Creek railhead came in at 2:30, and Maren was the last one off. She'd been raised in an orphanage back east, grew up there, and when she was old enough to leave, she'd stayed on anyway, taking in mending, saving every coin she could, because there was nowhere else and no one waiting. 3 years of that. 3 years of needle and thread and other people's torn hems, saving toward a life that hadn't started yet. Then the letter came. A man out west looking for a wife. She read it twice. She signed her name. She spent the very last coin she had on the ticket. And she got on the train with one bag and a dress she'd pressed the night before. And she let herself believe, just a little, that she was traveling towards something good. His name was Orvis Crane. He'd filed the arrangement 8 months earlier, and in those 8 months, he had quietly changed his mind and never written a single word to tell her, because telling her would have meant she stayed home, and Orvis Crane was not the kind of man who did the decent thing when the cruel thing was easier. So she came all that way for nothing. The platform emptied around her. The afternoon went gray and cold, and Maren Ashby stood alone in a town where she knew no one, with no money, no husband, and no way back. Across the street, the door of the hardware store opened. A man stepped out onto the boardwalk with a paper bag of fittings in his hand, big through the shoulders, sawdust still on his sleeve from a morning's work, a carpenter's hands, scarred and sure. He was maybe 32, and he had the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long he'd stopped noticing the weight of it. His name was Emmett Call. He stopped on the step, and he looked at the platform. He saw the woman standing alone. He saw the bag at her feet. He saw the straight back, and the level chin, and the empty space right beside her, where a man had just been standing. He didn't know her. He didn't know a single thing about her, but he set his bag down on the boardwalk, and he crossed the street. He stopped at the bottom of the platform steps and looked up at her. Emmett Call, he said, just his name, no speech, no softening it. I've got 2 children and a house that needs keeping. I do carpentry work 3 days a week, so mornings you'd have the place to yourself. She looked down at him and said nothing yet, taking his measure the way you take the measure of a man when your whole future might depend on being right about him. It's temporary, he said, room and board, until you've sorted out what's next. That's all I'm offering. That's all it is." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind came down off the hills, cold and clean. Then she asked him the only question that mattered to a woman with nothing left to lose. "Can you cook?" That's not what he asked her. That's what she asked him, turned right around. Because she wasn't going to be the one standing there like a beggar. And Emmett Call, who had heard hard questions before, understood exactly what she was doing. He almost smiled. Almost. "No," he admitted. "Truth is, no. That's most of the trouble." She held his eyes a moment longer. "Then it's a good thing I can," she said. "I can cook, and I'm not afraid of hard work." She bent down and picked up her bag. "Then let's go," she said. And they walked off that platform together, side by side, while behind them the town of Coldwater Bend watched every step and stored it all up for later. The Call cabin sat at the edge of town, a horse in a side pen, a porch step that had been meaning to get fixed for a good long while. Marin noticed it and said nothing. Inside, the front room was clean. The way a house is clean when a man is running it alone. Everything in its place, everything working, and nothing soft in the whole room. A long workbench against the far wall. A stove doing its steady work in the corner, and up on the shelf above the kitchen window sat a small sewing basket with a wooden lid. It had the look of something no one had touched in a long, long time. Something the whole house had quietly agreed to leave alone. Marin looked at it. She didn't ask. Emmett showed her the room off the kitchen. Her own door. Her own space. "Children eat at 6, he said. "I eat when I get back." That was when the boy came out. He came from the back of the house with the careful timing of a child who'd been listening from somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. 10 years old. His father's shoulders already starting to show, and a face that gave away absolutely nothing. His name was Wells. He looked at Marin the way you look at something you've seen a version of before and have already decided not to trust. Then he looked at his father, long and flat. And then, without one single word, he turned and walked back the way he'd come. That silence said more than shouting would have. And Marin understood, standing there in that clean, hard little room, that whatever this house was, the boy who wouldn't speak, the basket no one touched, there was a wound in it somewhere that nobody had named yet. Then a small voice said, "Are you new?" Marin turned. A little girl stood in the bedroom doorway, 6 years old. One ribbon tied up neat and the other just hanging loose. And she was looking at Marin with her whole face, the wide-open, unguarded stare of a child who hasn't yet learned to hide what she wants. Her name was Nellie. "I'm new," Marin said gently. "Are you hungry?" Nellie considered the question with great seriousness. "A little bit." "Come help me then," Marin said. "Let's find out what's in the larder." And Nellie came. No hesitation, no shyness. She just crossed the room and slipped her small hand into whatever help she could offer. The way a child does, when she has already secretly made up her mind about somebody. Supper that first night was beans and cornbread, and a broth that had absolutely no business smelling as good as it did, given how bare that larder was. The smell of it reached the front room before anyone even sat down. Emmett came in from the yard, and he stopped just inside the door. Something moved across his face. A memory, maybe, of a house that used to smell like this. And then he set it aside and said nothing. Wells ate in silence. Nellie ate with her eyes going back and forth between her bowl and Marin, over and over. And then, partway through the meal, Nellie set down her spoon. "The last lady who kept house for us burned everything," she announced. "Nellie," her father said quietly. But the little girl just looked at Marin instead. "She did, though, everything." "Well," Marin said, eyes on her plate. Burnt beans are a serious matter. I don't take them lightly. And across the table, the corner of the boy's mouth moved. Just once, just for a second. Then it went right back to where it had been. But he'd almost smiled. And after supper, Wells stayed at the table a little longer than he needed to before going off to bed. His father noticed and said nothing. The next morning, Emmett came off the porch, and the loose step held firm under his boot. He stopped, pressed it again with his weight, stood there a moment in the cold. Then he went back inside and poured 2 cups of coffee, and he set one down on the counter, near where Maren was already working. He didn't say a word about the step. She'd fixed it, or wedged it, sometime before he'd woken. She didn't say anything about it either. They drank their coffee in the early quiet, while the cold morning settled around the house. And that was how it went between them, from the very start, not with speeches, but with small things done and left unmentioned. A step fixed, a cup poured. A kind of language 2 careful people use before either of them is ready to say a word out loud. But the boy was another matter. Wells tested her on the 5th day. She'd asked him to bring in firewood, and he simply didn't. He settled in with a look on his face, waiting to see what she'd do about it. Maren appeared in the doorway of the back room. Wells, the wood. He looked up at her. I was getting to it. I know, she said, calm even. He held her gaze, testing. Looking for something, for anger maybe, or for her to give up and do it herself, or for the first crack in whoever this woman really was. He didn't find it, so he got up, and he brought the wood in without another word. Thank you, she said, plain and simple, and went back to the kitchen. Emmett had heard the whole thing from his workbench. He set his plane down, and he stood there in the quiet for a while before he picked it back up. Because something was starting to happen in that house. And he didn't dare look at it too directly yet. After that, the days began to find their shape. Wells started staying at the table after meals, whittling or reading, just present, in a way he hadn't been before. Nellie followed Maren from room to room like a little shadow, helping where she could reach and watching hard where she couldn't. And Emmett started coming home from his carpentry work at the very same hour every single evening. One night, Maren read to Nellie from an old book of stories on the shelf. She did all the voices too, without a scrap of embarrassment. And Nellie pressed into her side, with the complete trust of a child who has made a decision and sees no reason on earth to go back on it. At the far end of the room, Wells sat with something in his hands. He didn't look up, but he didn't leave either, and that basket still sat up on the shelf, untouched. Nobody said what it was. Nobody had to. It was the last thing left of the woman who used to keep this house. The mother these children had lost, the wife this man had buried. It sat up there in the light like a held breath. Like grief, no one knew how to put down. By the time the frost had settled into the mornings for good, Nellie had stopped following Maren around like a guest. She followed her around like a child at home, and then, one gray and ordinary morning, it happened. Nellie was crossing the kitchen in her socks, still warm from sleep, lost in some private 6-year-old business. And she caught her foot on the threshold and went down hard on both little palms. She made that startled sound. The one that comes before a child has decided whether it's worth crying about. She decided it was. Maren was down on the floor with her before the crying even got going. She took both small hands in hers, turned the palms up, looked them over, held them warm and steady, not making a fuss, not going anywhere. And Nellie, without meaning to say anything at all, said the word that was simply true to her now, Mama. And that word went into the cabin, and it did not leave. Maren's hands went still, just for one breath, no more than that. Then she gathered the little girl up and held her until the crying wore itself out, calm and certain, giving no outward sign of what that one word had just done to her heart. But she wasn't the only one who heard it. Emmett was standing in the bedroom doorway. He'd heard every bit of it. And he stood there with one hand on the frame, staring at the hallway floor, not moving a muscle. Because something was happening inside him, and he was keeping his eyes carefully away from it. Some things change the moment you look straight at them. And he wasn't ready. At the table, Wells had gone completely still. 10 years old, and he knew exactly what he'd just heard, and exactly what it meant. And something in that boy's face, something that had been shut and locked for a long, long time, was working its slow way toward open. Emmett turned and went back into his room. He sat down on the edge of the bed with his hand flat on his knee, and he stayed like that a long while as the quiet morning moved around the house. Because here's the thing about a wound everyone's agreed not to name. Sooner or later, life reaches in and names it for you. And now the word had been said out loud. Mama. In a house that had lost its mother. Nobody in that cabin knew yet what to do with it. But everybody in it felt the ground shift. The trouble was, so did the town, because in Coldwater Bend, nothing stayed inside 4 walls for long. It started at the general store counter on a Friday afternoon. A woman named Adelia Verse came to stand beside Marin with the warm, practiced manner of a woman who has rehearsed her concern at home in front of a mirror. She talked about appearances, about what people were saying, about the natural shape a situation takes when it's just left to drift along, and about the confusion, such a shame, really, of children getting the wrong idea about what an arrangement really was. She chose each word the way a person chooses a tool, for exactly what it would do, and then she left, without buying a single thing. Marin set her coins down on the counter, one at a time, and she walked home. She was 25 years old, and she had been sized up by women with rehearsed voices in enough rooms, in enough towns, to have built a hard, durable patience for it. The patience of a woman who knows, all the way down, that another person's measure of you is not the truth about you. She stood at the kitchen window that afternoon with her hands on the sill, looking out at the yard and the line of pines and the flat, cold sky. Longer than she needed to. Then she started supper. That evening, Emmett was at the stove and she was finishing the dishes. And without looking up from the fire, he said, "You all right?" She kept her hands in seats and basin. She thought about it honestly before she answered. "I am," she said. He nodded once at the fire. And that was all, but it was the first time he'd asked. The first time he'd let her see that he'd noticed something was pressing on her. The room held its quiet around them both, warm and close. But the gossip didn't stay at the store. It moved, and a month later, in a saloon across town, it reached exactly the wrong pair of ears. A man named Dale Renner had no intention of causing any trouble at all. He was just talking the easy men talk at the end of a long day. He said the call place looked different lately. Smoke coming out of the chimney at the right hours. The children looking steadier, and that woman from the platform. Remember her? The one Orvis Crane left standing there in front of half the town. Something about her, Dale said. Those kids had taken to her like he'd never seen. Even the older boy was coming around. And the little girl, well, the little girl had started calling her mama. Dale reached for his glass, not noticing the man gone still at the end of the bar. He said it was a fine thing, really. Good to see that house with some life back in it. At the end of the bar, Orvis Crane didn't move. He still had those agency papers folded up in his coat. He still had a pride that had sat wrong in his gut ever since that day on the platform. And now, listening, a picture was forming behind his eyes. Warm light in the windows. Children settled and fed. Smoke at the right hours. A house with life in it. A woman the children had already started to call Mama. A woman he had thrown away. Now, standing in the middle of everything he'd told himself he never wanted, Orvis Crane set his coins down on the bar and stood up. "Where does Call live?" he said. It was a Thursday morning, cold and bright and clear. Emmett and Marin were coming out of the post office together. He'd gone to collect a timber notice, and she'd walked in with him because the children were at school and the morning had just run that way. The two of them, walking easy, side by side, and Orvis Crane stepped out into the middle of the street. He had the papers in his hand and his voice pitched loud so it would carry, the same way it had carried that first day. The fare was paid, he called out. The contract was signed. People stopped. A woman by the dry goods store went still. Two men outside the feed store turned around. The cold air seemed to hold everything in place. An obligation doesn't just dissolve, Orvis said, holding those papers up high like a deed to land, because a woman found somewhere more comfortable to sit. And then he used a word. He pointed at Marin, and he called her his, and the whole street heard it land. Marin stood beside Emmett. She did not step back. She did not so much as look at Orvis Crane. She held herself exactly the way she'd held herself that first day on the platform. Straight, still, unbroken. Except this time was different. This time there was a man standing right beside her, and the whole street could see that he hadn't moved an inch. Emmett looked at the papers. Then he looked at Orvis Crane, long and slow. Then he turned to Marin, and when he spoke, his voice was low and even, meant just for her. "Stay here," he said. Not a command, not an order. The way a man says it to someone he is coming right back to. And then he walked away, down the street, toward the bank. And the whole town held its breath, wondering what in the world he was going to do. He was inside the bank for 4 minutes. 4 minutes, while Orvis Crane stood in the street with his papers, and Marin stood alone but not alone, and the town waited. Then Emmett came out with money in his hand, not a few dollars. Everything. 2 years of savings he had kept hidden under the floorboards of that cabin. Every coin he had scraped and set aside toward one dream, buying back into a proper ranch. The slow, patient work of a man rebuilding his whole life from the ground up, one board and $1 at a time. He carried all of it across that street. He walked right up to Orvis Crane, and he took that man's hand, and he pressed the money into it, and he held it there until Crane's fingers closed around it. "That settles the fare," Emmett said. "The fee. And every last excuse you rode into this town with." His voice was flat, final, the voice of a man who has made up his mind and will not be turning back. "It does not buy her," he said. "Understand me. It does not buy her. It frees her from you." He let go of the man's hand. "Now go." Orvis Crane looked down at the money. He looked up at the whole street looking back at him, and then he looked one last time at Marin, searching her face for something. For regret, maybe. For a woman who wanted to be rescued back into his arms. And whatever he found there, it was not what he had ridden all this way for. So he walked to his horse. He climbed up and he rode out of Coldwater Bend, and the cold, bright morning closed up behind him like he'd never been there at all. The street let out its breath, and Emmett Call turned around. Not to the crowd. To her. She was already looking at him, hands at her sides, and the exhaustion she'd carried in her eyes since that very first day on the platform, it was gone. Something steadier had taken its place, the look of a woman who is finally standing on ground that holds. Emmett came and stood in front of her. The wind came down off the hills between them, clean and cold. He'd crossed a street for her once before he'd even decided to. He'd left a cup of coffee on a counter and made nothing of it. He'd just handed 2 years of his life, his whole dream of a ranch, to another man without a second's pause. Because standing by and letting her be taken was simply not a thing he was able to do. He was not a man who dressed things up prettier than they were, and he wasn't about to start now. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "as my wife, if that's what you want." And Maren looked at this man, and she took the time that choosing for yourself requires, real time, and nobody rushed her, and the whole cold street just waited on her answer. "Yes," she said, quietly, completely, with nothing held back at all. "That's what I want." Emmett let out one long, slow breath, and his hand found hers and closed around it. And all around them, the town of Coldwater Bend came back to life. Boots on the boardwalk, a door somewhere opening and swinging shut, the wind off the hills, steady and clean, and the pale winter sky going on and on above all of it. The ranch would have to wait now. All that saved-up money was gone, but for the first time in years, waiting didn't feel like losing. Some weeks later, the cabin was warm against the cold. Wells sat at the table with a short length of wood and his father's smallest plane, working the edge down slow by feel, the tip of his tongue caught between his teeth. Nellie was on the floor with her rag doll, deep in some matter of great importance that did not require any grown-up help whatsoever. And from the stove came the smell of something with molasses in it. A new thing Maren was working out, tasting and adjusting as she went. The kind of smell that gets down into the walls of a kitchen and stays there for years. The door opened, cold air, and then Emmett's boots on the step. The sound of a man who knows his coming home is expected, and who has finally stopped taking that for granted. Nellie lifted the rag doll in his direction by way of hello and went straight back to her business. And Wells looked up at his father in the doorway. Then he looked back down at his work and kept on planing. But that look had carried something in it, now that had not been there at the beginning. Not a wall anymore. Something closer to a welcome. Emmett crossed the room and stood by beside Maren at the stove and looked at what she was cooking. She held the spoon out to him without a word. He tasted it, considered it, slow and careful, taking his time. Then he looked at her. She took the spoon back before he could even say it. "I know," she said. "More molasses." And the corner of his mouth moved, the same way his sons had that very first night over a joke about burnt beans. Then he went to hang up his coat, and he left her to her work. And up on the shelf above the window, that little sewing basket sat right where it had always sat. But it didn't sit like grief anymore. It sat like something a family keeps, a memory they can finally hold gently, instead of a wound they have to walk around. The late afternoon light came through the glass and rested on the wooden lid, warm and still. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The horse shifted in its pen, and somewhere past the trees, a bird called once, long and unhurried. The cabin held its warmth, not waiting for anyone, not anymore. And that is the story of Maren Ashby. A woman who was thrown away on a train platform in front of a whole town, with nothing to her name but one bag and a straight spine, and who walked out of that town, one winter later, with everything that actually matters. A man asked her a question that first cold afternoon. Not the one you'd think. She turned it right around on him instead. "Can you cook?" And that small, brave answer, "I can, and I'm not afraid of hard work," gave her the one thing 3 years of waiting never had. It gave her a family. If this story warmed your heart, let me know down in the comments. And stay a while. I've got another one just like it waiting for you.